So might as well just quick flick through to the next one, if you like, Jason. So apologies if not everybody is listening has been in the Corps and understands this. So I've just got a few slides to sort of give you an overview of the history, the role and history of the RAMC, casualty evacuation chain, and some of the problems that the airborne medics had in World War II. So as always, as we know, the role of the RAMC in peace and war has always been the maintenance and repair of the fighting men. As we know, the Corps was formed on the 23rd of June 1898, and obviously cut its teeth first in action in South Africa in the Boer War. So in the Great War, Corps grew to around 180,000 all ranks, but obviously slimmed down after the war was over. And the Second World War, when it started, and the changing shape of warfare from then gave the RAMC problems they needed to solve, namely airborne and commando operations. So you can just press next, please. So this is the dreaded usual casualty evacuation chain that we all come to know and love, from the point of wounding through the regimental aid post, where the regimental medical officer would give some basic first aid and his team with the team. Casualties collected by the field ambulance section, taken to the main dressing station run by the field ambulance, then taken to a casualty clearing station, which is realistically in the chain the first place that surgery can effectively be carried out, and then back to a field or general hospital, and often cases they would be in the UK, so you get convalescent treatment. So that would be the normal casualty evacuation chain for normal ground-based warfare, shall we say. So if you want to crack on to the next one, please, Jason. But of course, as you'll see in a couple of slides time, or it might even be the next one, that casualty evacuation chain couldn't be adhered to or used, and that there were these problems for the airborne medics. You're likely to be behind enemy lines at the start of the operation, unable to evacuate casualties until reached or relieved by the ground forces. The normal field ambulance in 1939 did not have surgical facilities. What equipment can be taken given the weight constraints? Where do the men come from who are going to volunteer from these for the airborne medics? How to move casualties from the point of wounded to a medical facility, bearing in mind in the early years of the Second World War, it was not possible to parachute jeeps into example. And hopefully in the next 5 hours or so, I will explain to you how some of these problems were overcome from the use of the slides in my mouth, and for example, using the slides and pictures. And obviously some of these were overcome by the attaching FSTs, field surgical teams, to the airborne medical units, use of FFS, which is fitted for stretcher jeeps, and inventing new equipment. I'm not going to go through a whole range of the equipment that was used just for time wise, but we'll crack on and hopefully still give you a flavour of some of the stuff that was used by the airborne medics. So we can move to the next one, please. So some notable dates. Obviously you can see in the early history of the airborne forces and the airborne medical services. 20th of June 1940 was when Churchill's memo called about forming an airborne corps of around 5,000 men. And obviously they started off by converting one of the airborne commandos, sorry, not the airborne commandos, number 2 commando into an airborne one, and they started parachuting at Ringway in July 1940. So that as the sort of the growth continued generically, volunteers were asked for a parachute medical unit in early 1941. In April 1941, 16 parachute field ambulance was officially formed. Then in October 41, Airborne HQ under Major General Frederick Boy Browning was formed. Those of you that have seen The Bridge Too Far, that's the character of Dirk Bogart, by a Lieutenant General by the time of Market Garden, Arnhem time. So then there was a guy called Austin Eager, Colonel, appointed as the first Assistant Director Medical Services, the ADMS. Meanwhile, they were deciding that as well as parachute troops, we would use guys to arrive on the battlefield by gliders. And so this unit, known as 31 Independent Infantry Brigade, was told it was now an air landing unit, and the medical support unit in that brigade, 181 field ambulance was now told they were an air landing one. And some men from 181 went on Operation Biting, which was the Bruneval raid, when paratroopers jumped into northern France to investigate the radar equipment at a German radar station, obviously, and then the 181 medics from 181 were in the landing craft and on the ships to treat any wounded that were incurred on the raid, which they did do. And obviously from these small starts, the airborne medics later supported operations in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, Arnhem and Germany, amongst other places. So if we'd like to crack on, please, Jason. Thank you. So this is the overall plan for the 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem in a simplistic form. They were going to form this half circle, for want of a better word, around the town of Arnhem and Oosterbeek, with the 1st Air Landing Brigade, the 4th Parachute Brigade, the 1st Parachute Brigade and the Polish Brigade all being concentrated in that little area marked by the red dotted line. And in that would mean that they would have taken 3 bridges over the Rhine, the railway bridge from my left to your right. You've got the railway bridge, the pontoon bridge and the road bridge. That was the plan. As you can see over on the the left-hand side of the screen, you have where the DZs, the drop zones and the landing zones were going to be for the first 3 days. So that was the plan anyway. If we could go on, please. So in simplistic terms, the medical plan, the field ambulances would be under the commands of the brigades, and there was 1 field ambulance per brigade during the initial stages of the operation, and will be responsible for clearing the drop zones, landing zones to the dressing station in the landing zone, drop zone area. 181 field ambulance would be responsible for a temporary dressing station in the area and for the care and treatment of all these early casualties. Once the situation had stabilised and Arnhem had been occupied, for once, rather than operating in farmers' yard, barns, buildings, schools, or wherever they could find, as they had been in, say, like Normandy and North Africa, 2 of the field ambulances were being told that they could go and set up shop in hospitals in Arnhem. 16 parachute field ambulance going to the St Elizabeth Hospital, 181 going to the municipal hospital, and 133 in theory trying to find a hospital, but my suspect is they would have ended up in a school. And once all the 3 units had been part of the divisional perimeter, units were then to revert to the Colonel Warwick, who was the ADMS, the Assistant Director Medical Services Control, and efforts will be made to open dressing stations in rotation and start evacuation by road and air as soon as possible. And when we say evacuation by air, the plan was that there was an airfield known as Deelen, about 5 miles north of Arnhem, that was going to be taken, and an American engineer battalion was going to be flown in there to make sure that the runway was good enough for aircraft to use. Dakotas would have been flown in with supplies, and the wounded would have been evacuated out together with the glider pilots. And that would be what the reserve section of 181 were going to do, and they were going to go open this casualty air evacuation centre, as it says, when the local airfield had been captured and was operating. So if you'd like to move on, please. So again, a little bit of a lower level to understand some of that in English that we can all understand. Casualties occur in the formations to be retained by the divisional medical units in the divisional areas until the medical units of the supporting force have arrived in the area. So basically, nowhere to evacuate them to, as we will see, and so you've got to look after them. When the supporting force troops have arrived, they will be evacuated. I've spoken about the airfield again, as it says, to be casualties to be returned to the UK in supply aircraft as soon as possible. A casualty clearing station where the surgery could be carried out if necessary from the ground troops will be secured in Arnhem and Nijmegen. Medical units were to carry with them sufficient medical stores and equipment, customated casualties for a minimum of 48 hours, maximum 72. And then the other problem with an airborne operation, you are operating behind enemy lines, So you need to have supplies coming in by air, and that was what they had packed before they had left the UK, 5 days worth of air medical supplies to be dropped by air. And again, there was also this seaborne tail, for want of a better word, that had driven all the way up from Normandy, and as part of the 30 Corps traffic jam, they were going to carry some more men, and they would also transport, certainly most of the medics transport was in this seaborne tail, and they also would have 5 days worth of medical supplies. The other thing that I need to perhaps mention here is that when the airborne units were relieved, they then came under control of the ground troops that relieved them, and often fought on as ground-based infantry, for want of a better word, and support troops until they were sent back to the UK. So, for example, we all know that the 6th of June was D-Day 1944, when Normandy started, and that was carried out by men from the 6th Airborne Division. They did not get back to England, the last of them, till the 9th of September. So they were in Normandy for the best part of 3 months, fighting on as ground troops. So, but I digress. That's a story perhaps for another day. So if we could move on, please, Jason. So what is a field ambulance? A field ambulance was the name used to describe a mobile medical unit that treats wounded soldiers very close to the combat zone. Normally 1 per infantry brigade, with 1 of the field ambulance sections supporting each battalion, around 200 at all ranks, with a number of doctors and a dental officer, but no surgeons. That is a ground-based field ambulance. So if we could crack on, please. So a PFA, parachute field ambulance, normally consists of a headquarters and 4 sections, giving a total of around 180 all ranks. So as you can see, quickly broken down: a headquarters, the commanding officer, the 2 IC, the second in command, 2 surgeons, an anaesthetist, and a quartermaster, with 35 other ranks. 4 sections, 1 officer, 19 other ranks each. With the attached supporting arms, the Royal Engineers, a sapper, a carpenter to look after the stretchers and make anything, and the coffins, as I say, should they be needed. The Royal Army Service Corps, quite a large number there, as you can see. Well, they were, of course, for the drivers to drive the various vehicles. The Dental Corps, 1 officer and 1 other rank. The dental officer usually doubled up as an anaesthetist with the field surgical team, because there was only 1 anaesthetist, 2 surgeons but 1 anaesthetist. And then finally the sorry, not quite finally, you've got the PTI, the physical training instructor, keep the guys fit, one man, 1 sergeant, and then the catering corps for 5 other ranks. What you would normally find is that although there were 4 sections, 3 of them would be attached to the infantry battalions, and the other 1 would go and help out at the MDS, the main dressing station, with the headquarters. So if we could quickly crack on, please. So there we are. So as well as the 3 major medical units, officers and men were attached to the HQ brigades and division, the infantry battalions, and other units such as the Reconnaissance Squadron, Light Regiment, Royal Artillery, and the 21st Independent Parachute Company. So in total to Arnhem, according to one report that I found, 46 officers and 542 men. So you had medics spread throughout the whole of the division, attached to the infantry battalions and some of the other units. But let's crack on, Jason. Thank you. So just a few wartime pictures here. You can see the guy on the left is what we would describe as almost jumping in clean fatigue. It's just basically him with his parachute on the back. He would have, of course, then carried a kit bag full of his webbing, equipment, mess tins, and some medical equipment, water bottles, and so on and so on. So then what you get is, like in the second and third, or the middle and the right hand picture, is after he's landed on the ground, ready to go off to war. He's got ammo pouches, but they didn't normally carry ammo in them. They put medical supplies in them. You will see that he's got his toggle rope and what we would call stretcher slings around his neck. And again, on the right hand side, just a rear view, just basically carrying some equipment. But I think the next one will demonstrate this quite better. Here we are. So this is the guys on the ground, as you can see in the middle, quite a nice one. He's got his small pack, or a first aid haversack, attached to his webbing above his small pack, with some Cranmer wire splinting, if you can see it there in the middle picture, on his back, there's that wire mesh that was used for splinting, toggle ropes, stretcher slings on the guy on the right hand side, lamps, and that was basically the Mark I leather personnel carrier that the REMC used to carry a lot of the equipment. Crack on then, Jason. And here we are, as you can see, a guy a bit more loaded. So you can see here, better view of the first aid pack on the back of his small pack. And then on the guy on the right hand side, he's not only carrying a folding stretcher, that was specially invented for the airborne forces to save space, because we all know how long stretchers are. They're obviously six foot long, but these were folded with brackets and hinges and locking pins, so it made it easier to carry. And he's carrying a blanket around his neck as well. So that'll give you some idea. So here you are. This is unfortunately, it's a bit of a reenactor, and I'm not overly enamoured with the colour of his smock. But it's a nice colour photograph. Will give you an idea of some of the equipment that he would be carrying when they were walking to their objective, for want of a better word. Okay, so if we can move on. So just to break that down there, 10 officers, 125 men, 133, 10 officers, 119 men. They were the 2 parachute field ambulances. 181, if you throw in the reserve section as well, as you can see, they were numerically stronger, had 11 officers and 127 men. And then these 17 officers and 171 men were split between the various infantry battalions and the other units that I've mentioned before. And again, we come up with the grand total of 606. So if we'd like to move on, please. So how did they get to Arnhem? 16 6 Dakota aircraft, 133 again 6 Dakota aircraft, 181 came in 9 Horsa gliders on the first lift, and the reserve section came in 3 Horsa gliders on the second lift. Now, I apologise if you're not too sure of some of these terminology or what a Horsa glider looks like, but we do have some pretty pictures of some of these things a little bit later on. So if you go to the next slide, please. So that gives you an idea of what it would have been like inside the Dakota. This is not a colorized photograph. This is one of the few Imperial War Museum Army Film Photography Units images that was taken in color. And it actually shows men of the 10th Parachute Battalion. They're not medics, but I used it as it's a color photo, and it gives you an idea of what it would have been like inside the Dakota. Normally carried 18 men with all their equipment. So as you can see, we've spoken about guys jumping with a kit bag. So as you can see, you've got 2 kit bags on the middle of the floor. That would be crammed full of their equipment and also medical supplies. But these are paratroop regiment soldiers, so likely to have ammunition, mortar bombs as well. But they'll give you an idea of what it was like. So there's a Horsa glider. These could carry a maximum of 32 men, or a combination of equipment and men. Certainly, as you can see, you could get a Jeep in there. Once they pushed it up, he put hard steering lock right on, and it went into the Horsa. Then they would probably put a trailer in behind it if necessary, or they could even put a 6-pounder anti-tank gun in there, motorcycles, and they drove out through when they'd landed, they chopped the tail off and they went out through the tail to make it easier. Okay, so that's a Horsa glider. So the airborne evacuation chain, as I spoke about briefly, point of wounded to the regimental aid post, collected by the section and taken to the main dressing station. So you can now see how the main dressing station has become key in the airborne evacuation chain. If we go to the next slide, please. And again, this gives you an idea of the transport taken. So as you can see, basically the units had around 6 Jeeps each, 6 or 8 Jeeps. The reserve section had another 2 from 181, and the air landing battalions had 3. So that's 1 with the medical officer, the light regiment 1, HQRA 1, and the ADMS staff 1. So 28 Jeeps taken that you saw just loaded into the Horsa glider, 22 trailers that they would have used with medical equipment, supplies, food, etc., etc. 6 350cc motorcycles and 13 125cc motorcycles. So they will be used for like scouting the way, passing messages around. They could not be obviously used for casualty evacuation. So we go to the next one, please. And there's your airborne ambulance, for want of a better word, the ubiquitous Ford and Willis Jeep used by the Tilbury by the Ground Force. They use these for evacuating casualties. This is what we call fitted for stretcher, FFS, and they could actually carry 3 stretchers on there. There was 2 on the back, as you can see, and 1 also went across the bonnet. And there are a German picture, which I haven't used, unfortunately. Otherwise, we would be here literally all day, of a British officer on the Jeep, of a captured Jeep. Anyway, so you can see that the Red Cross marked on the bonnet, hopefully signifying that it's a medical unit, not a medical Jeep, not to be fired at. And I think the next one, hopefully, is a black and white from of a World War II airborne Jeep in action. And there is this picture, unfortunately, was taken in Normandy, but it will give you an idea of what it was like to be on the front of the Jeep. And as you can see, the guys have tried to make it as clear as possible that it's a medical Jeep. You will notice there looks like there's a big Red Cross flag underneath the stretcher tied on the bonnet, but there's also one in the spare tyre and one on the windscreen. If we could crack on, please. So there we are, the plan. 181, early days. 181 to set up a divisional main dressing station in Wolfhazer to treat the casualties from the landing. 16 to move on Lion route, the river route, with the 2nd Parachute Battalion of the 1st Brigade HQ to Arnhem and set up their MDS at the St Elizabeth Hospital. 181 to later move to the Municipal Hospital in Arnhem to set up their MDS, and 133 to move on their arrival to the brigade area and find a suitable building to set up their MBS. So for the just going to pause here for a second, Jason. I'm just going to say to you, ladies and gentlemen, that the next little bit of the talk is I'm going to talk about the 3 field ambulances, if you like, separately for a while, rather than bringing it all together. So if we'll crack on, and I'm pretty confident that 181 is first. So we're quite lucky with 181 is that there were 3 Army film and photographic unit photographers sent to Arnhem, and one of them took some photographs of 181 in action at the main dressing station that have been set up in Wolfhazer. So these are guys carrying. I'm not sure whether sometimes they say carrying in and sometimes it's carrying out, but either way, it's George Cormack on the left and John Ireland on the right carrying the stretcher, taking a casualty into a house that's actually in a road called the Dutzikampsweg in Arnhem, number 9. So if we just move on, please, Jason. And then there's another nice photograph taken here. This is the off-duty field surgical team from 181 on the 18th of September. They were basically just waiting to go to work, and you can see you've got the medical officer on the extreme, sorry, he's not a medical officer, is he? He's a surgeon, Captain James, on the right hand side with his hands on his hips. You've got the Padre Benson there holding his helmet, and the other members of the team. As I always say to people out of them, two of the men in this photograph would not survive the fighting, and the rest of them would not see England until 1945. And the guy in the extreme left-hand side with his hands in his pockets and the braces is George Aldridge. Very good friend of mine while he was still alive. He used to live in Luton, and he always remembers them operating on a guy who'd been brought in with most of his intestines hanging out, as he said, blown up like balloons, and they obviously thought that he wouldn't survive the night, but they sorted him out. Then they moved off, and George never saw him, never knew what happened to the guy, except till he was going back to Arnhem in the 1990s on the Harwich to the Hook of Holland, and he was talking to another veteran who happened to be on the ferry, and George was telling him about the story about the guy, and it seems that the guy he was talking to was that same guy, and he actually survived. Let's hope it's the same guy. Anyway, shall we move on, please, to the next one? So this is literally, that is the house today on the 9 Duitsieskampsweg, German Camp Road, as it's known, because it was at the end of the road, there was a Dutch army training area, and they set up an internment camp for Germans there in the First World War. So that house is the same today. You can still see the doors just about where they were bringing the casualty in or out of, on just in the middle right. And so I could just go back one, Jason. I don't know whether you can move your cursor towards it, but just above on the gate.
Airborne in Arnhem.
Sorry?
Sorry, somebody's unmuted.
Yes. On the gate, as you can see, on the left-hand gate, it says Het, no, the Uda Felt Hospital. So I'll let them off to say that it wasn't quite a field hospital, but that's what they call it. And I know it wasn't taken on a still day, but that is a Pegasus flag flying there above it. So we can move on if you wouldn't mind, Jason. Thank you. And then the classic image of Corporal Midfields of 181 taken at Wolfhaven on the 18th of September again, with one of the casualties. This is one of the photographs that was used at the time in the newspapers, because you will notice that the casualty's name has been taken out by the censor on the wooden cross that was used. It was actually Trooper Edmund of the Recce Squadron who was ambushed about half a mile away. And I suppose even more chillingly, just on the other side of this, there is yet another grave already been dug, yet to be filled. So if you'd like to move on, please, Jason. So that's a little bit about 181 in the first couple of days. 16 obviously set off on Lion route with the 2nd Battalion, 1st Battalion HQ, right at the back of the Snake. And they got all the way to Arnhem virtually unmolested. Certainly at the back, there was very much a stop-start march. They ate their sandwiches, sat down in the road. Locals came and gave them refreshments, and eventually at about 8 o'clock in the evening they arrived at this building here known as the St Elizabeth Hospital in the outskirts of Arnhem, in Western Arnhem. And basically they walked up. One of the doctors was a South African Lithuanian Jew, a bit more about him later, spoke in theory a bit of Afrikaans, which he thought was very similar to Dutch. Asked to see the chief doctor, and he came down and introduced himself and said, you know, can we use it? And the power had been cut off, and he was holding a candle, and he took it up held it close to the uniforms, and he said, oh, you're English, are you? Can you please not speak German to us? But anyway, so then they explained what they wanted, and they were granted, if you like, one of the best locations, if not the best location for a parachute field ambulance in the Second World War. They were offered ward facilities, cooking facilities, use of the X-ray machines, nurses, and basically they set up shop in there. There was a lot of action going on along around here, and this photograph was taken on about the 20th, I think, and there's wrecks of 2 German. You can see there's 2 wrecked coaches in there. Well, they were fired upon by members of C Company of the 2nd Parachute Battalion, fired a couple of Piats into them. The Red Cross, homemade Red Cross, was put up there by a guy called John Batley, who was a member of number 4 section. Not spoken to him for a couple of years, but I believe he still is alive. But anyway, so for a couple of days, well, not quite a couple of days, for the first day, the 17th and the 18th, it was ideal facilities. Casualties were able to be brought in from the bridge without being molested, but then the Germans arrived, took most of the unit prisoner, but allowed the 2 surgical teams plus some others to stay. Then the Germans were driven out again on the 19th, but they came back on the 19th, and then the hospital was completely under German control from the 19th onwards. And the last medics didn't leave this hospital until the 13th of October, nearly 4 weeks after they arrived. So they were the last airborne troops to leave Arnhem, if you like. Right, so if we could go to the next one and give you a present day shot of the same entrance area today, and there in the middle foreground, front foreground, sorry, is the marker post that's been put up to say that the 16 parachute field ambulance worked in that hospital. It's no longer a hospital, it's private residential flats. I do have a friend who has a flat there, so I can get in there with, sometimes lets me have a key to get in. Very much unchanged, and I'll say a little bit more. But before you move on, let's quickly say exactly how many wounded were treated. The medics treated at Arnhem will never be known with any certainty. But out of about 12,000 men who went to Arnhem, about 2,400 came back. 1,485 were killed, which left around 6,500 of prisoners. And it's thought around 3,200 of those were wounded. And many of that number, of that 3,000, passed through the St. Elizabeth Hospital, even if only briefly. So if we could go to the next one, please, because inside the building there is this plaque presented to the St. Elizabeth Hospital by the veterans of the 1st Airborne Division, and that was presented on the 17th of September 1946 by Graham Warwick, who was the chief doctor, to the chairman of the Board of Trustees, and it's still in that building. Obviously, as I said, it's still not a private apartments, and I think from what I've been told by a Dutch friend, that is probably the first memorial on or in a building at Arnhem to anything of the 1st Airborne Division. I think it's probably, in my opinion, about 70% plus of the Arnhem and Oosterbeek wounded came through those doors. And the simple reason that's so large is that a medical truce was arranged on the 24th of September, and all of those 500, 600, 700 casualties at least were brought there on the 24th before being distributed out to other hospitals, mainly Apeldoorn. I don't know, do you want me to say a few words about the how long do you want me to talk for, Jason? Because I could throw in a little bit about the truce here if you think we're doing all right for time.
Well, I was imagining about sort of 50 minutes to an hour. So
right, well, I better not say anything about the truce then, and let's move on. So here we are, Lippmann Kessel. This is the Lippmann Kessel and Hackett, as we say. Lippmann Kessel was one of the 2 surgeons in 16 Parachute Field Ambulance. He'd been in the 16th for quite a long time. He'd been in North Africa as well, won a military cross there. An interesting bloke, as I said, born in South Africa to a Lithuanian mother, a German, and his mother was German, and he was also Jewish. Awarded a MBE and military cross for Arnhem, and he's buried when he died in about 1994. His family thought it would be nice to ask the Commonwealth War Graves Commission if he could be buried in the cemetery with the rest of his comrades. But of course, that is an absolute no-no. So he ended up being buried in the civilian cemetery across the road with quite a nice headstone on it that's got a Pegasus and the Star of David. Say a few more words about him in a minute. And then the guy on the right, Brigadier Hackett, the commander of the 4th Parachute Brigade, on the 24th of September, the day of the medical truce, he was wounded quite severely in the thigh and stomach by a mortar shell burst. And because of that truce, he was one of those who was brought down on the truce to the St. Elizabeth Hospital, and he was actually operated on by Lippmann Kessel within about 12 hours of being wounded. Interestingly enough, Lippmann Kessel wasn't operating at the time when he was brought in, but he did see him in what we can satisfactorily call reception, and there was a German officer, medical officer, was prowling around and suggested that because of the fact is that they didn't have a high recovery rate in the German army for abdominal wounds, that excuse my German, and I need to just check this. The German medical officer said to Lippmann Kessel that in his opinion the casualty was a member of the Brauchschuss oder Kopfschuss Spritzen Club, which basically meant in the case of a belly wound or a head wound, give a morphine injection so that you would kill him off or end his life, the recipe for a quick death. Lippmann Kessel said he would give it a go and operate it. He and his surgical team removed a splinter about 2 inches square, which had cut 12 perforations and 2 sections in Hackett's lower intestine. He was later to write, Hackett was a famous author, rose to the rank of general. He owed 40 years of his life to Lippmann Kessel, and in fact it turned out to be 57. Just another quick story about him. When Hackett was brought in, they knew who he was. So there was a guy called Sergeant Brian Tanuki. He was the nursing orderly sergeant in charge of the other ranks, for want of a better word at this point. And he removed all brigadiers in rank and insignia and feels he must be the only other rank in the British Army who, in his words, stripped a general of his rank. Needless to say, Hackett, with help, got out of the hospital, wrote a book about his Arnhem or his post-Arnhem experience called I Was a Stranger, and evaded in Holland and got back to British lines, I think in February 1945. But let's move on, because I don't want to keep you here all night, and we're cracking on quite well. So lastly, the last of the 3 field ambulances. Unfortunately, there are no photographs of 133 in action in the first 2 days in Holland. The picture on the left is of their drop zone, Ginkle Heath, that had been set on fire by the Germans. It was what we would call a hot DZ. The other picture on the right is of people, Brigade HQ rallying on Ginkle Heath. The Germans were around the DZ, so they caused casualties. They were firing at people. People got wounded, people landed and even landed in the burning heather. So there were a number of casualties actually on the Heath, and 133 was going to set up their main dressing station in the cafe to the north of the DZ, which is still there today. When the brigade moved off, once things had quietened down a little bit, a number of medics were left behind to look after these casualties, and they were taken prisoner the next day. So we've spoken about the other shots, so I think it would be quite good if we went to move to the next slide, please. So, cut a long story short, on the 19th, the 4th Parachute Brigade was trying to force their way through into Arnhem, and they came to a road that runs, if you like, north from Oosterbeek in the bottom of the map, and you've got the black blocking line there. 133 was somewhere in the area between that black line and LZ. The problem you've got is that the wounded were coming back to where the regimental aid posts and 133 were working, but the main place where they needed to be evacuated to was either Wolfhazer, where some of the guys went, which was 2 miles back that way, or even worse, 181 had now moved into Oosterbeek, so they had to take a circular route back all the way to Wolfhazer to cross the railway line to be taken to Oosterbeek. And that's what happened to some of the casualties. The brigade basically, and a lot of the 2 parachute battalions over the next couple of days basically ceased to exist, but some of the medics did manage to get into the Oosterbeek perimeter, and we'll try and say a few words about that. But let's move on to the next slide, please, Jason. So I'm sure many of you are probably aware of the story of Arnhem, that the bridge was never reinforced and eventually fell to the Germans on the 21st. Everybody pulled back, if you like, to what was called lecture
on Arnhem in Lippmann Kessel.
The Arnhem, the Oosterbeek perimeter, and
I'm very interested in World War II stuff.
Facilities set up in the Oosterbeek, ranging from a number of medical aid posts through to a surgical facility in the Tafelberg, a main dressing station in the Skernord Hotel, which is number 6 on your map, roughly in the middle of the reason why 181 came to Oosterbeek was the plan called for obviously the whole division to move into Arnhem to form that nice half circle around the town, and so they decided that a move from Wolfhazer to Oosterbeek would be a good stopgap on the afternoon of the 18th, as it was closer to Arnhem, and so all the wounded were brought down to after a recce by the the commanding officer of 181, Arthur Marrable, and Graham Warwick. They found a hotel called the Skernord. commandeered buses and other vehicles, horse and carts and various things, and moved all the wounded down to it and took over the Skjernord and looked upon that as, again, as a temporary stop until moving into the municipal hospital. And one more place I would like to mention to everybody, just take note of number 10, the regimental aid post of the Royal Artillery Light Regiment by Captain Martin, because we'll touch on him briefly later. So I'd just like to move on to the next slide, please, Jason, which hopefully might be this. No, it's this one. Right, before the perimeter had realistically been formed, there was a lot of ad hoc medical stations, groups of troops milling around without real areas to defend, and the Germans on the 19th were able almost to roam around this area almost at will. This area, this picture taken on the Utrechtweg, is only about 150 yards from that MDS crossroads. But the reason I like showing this one is you can see the guy, the medic, second in on from the left with his, do you see the two with their Red Cross armbands, holding his camouflage veil with both hands round his neck. That was one of the first airborne medic veterans I ever met, called Jeff Stanners. The Germans had overrun it and decided they would move as many people as possible, but they let the medics go back. So Jeff remained in the perimeter right until the end. I've got quite a lot to, I did have a little bit to say about Jeff, but I'm going to won't say it for reasons of brevity. There's a good word for a Thursday night. But by the end of the battle, Jeff had 37 shrapnel wounds in his body, and he won a Dutch bronze lion for his efforts at Arnhem Oosterbeek. Want to go to the next one, please, Jason? This is literally just taken a little bit further down the road. Again, you can see some walking wounded, for want of a better word. You will note that they are wearing the, I don't know what they use these days, but certainly in my time, we used the field medical card. As you can see, two of them. The guy with one hand up on the extreme left has got his field medical card around his neck. Also, the guy with his arm in a sling and smock in the middle-ish. And you can note the Red Cross flag. Sorry, the Red Cross sign denoting that there's a medical facility. And this is literally taken just down the road from 5-10 yards from where the previous photograph was taken. And the next one, please, which I think is the stretcher bearers. And again, you can see the MDS crossroads is literally just the other side of that lamppost on the middle rear left there. You will note there's a German armoured vehicle behind the officer on the left, and there's a bunch of other British airborne prisoners there. Now, the guy with his Red Cross armband, that's Sandy Flockhart, who was the dental officer of 133, and the Germans had been told that they needed to move out of the dental surgery where we was looking after a few casualties. You can see also the other thing about this picture, that fence location is almost exactly the same as it is today, but you will note the discarded equipment. Can you see that there's a just in front of their feet, the two guys at the front, there is a helmet, airborne helmet in the gutter. So a lot of these cases obviously were taken down towards the SEH for further treatment before they were also, some of them were kept there and others were sent off to other prisoner of war hospitals or even prisoner of war camp if they weren't too badly wounded. So if we go to the next one, please. And again, this is again taken on the 20th, a little bit further towards Arnhem in Oosterbeek, and the guy on the rear left-hand corner with the beret on, with his face obscured by cigarette smoke, is Frank Calliope from 133. Probably an abdominal wound, as I reckon here, because the guy's got his legs in the W position with the blanket over it. But that gives you, this is again on the 20th, before the real formation of the Oosterbeek perimeter, where the Germans, you know, a couple of hours later or even next day, those Germans in the background would not be standing around like that, having a chat and having a fag, because they would have been shot at. But if we could move to the next one, please, Jason. So, we're going back to the future. This is on the left-hand side. You can see the Skjernord Hotel as it was in 1944-ish. Pretty much an ideal location. You've got large rooms that could be used as wards. cooking facilities, etc., etc. Sadly, the photograph on the right-hand side is again of the schooner. You can just about make out the front windows there. And that wreckage is of a Dutch civilian vehicle that was bringing milk churns full of water, driven by a Dutch Jew called Samuel Swartz, who was in hiding in Oosterbeek because he'd volunteered to help the British when they came to the area. And that was hit by a mortar shell, and basically he died, and he is now the only Dutch civilian buried in the cemetery at Oosterbeek. I've got a note here, so let me just quickly read this. Colonel Warwick, the ADS, wrote in his diary, 0900, just as I was about to leave the MDS, I'll deposit in the wounded Yank, a Dutch civilian car was hit outside the DS and burst into flames. We pulled one of the occupants clear. That was a guy called Wim Gerritsen. The other one was burnt to death, and that was Samuel Swartz. So if we could move on, please, Jason. Then just down the road towards the river on the Petersburg Weg is a hotel, or was a hotel called the Tafelberg, that had been used as Modal's HQ before he left. That was taken over as a surgical facility by 181, and the two surgeons, Captain James and Captain Rigby Jones, both operated in there, sometimes using the billiard table. These two shots, unfortunately, come from the classic film Theirs is the Glory. A certain Dr. Gerrit von Marnen was here as well. He was a local doctor. The Dutch Red Cross Committee, for want of a better words, had identified the Tafelberg to be used as their emergency hospital if fighting ever came to Oosterbeek anyway, and he offered his services. Those of you that have seen the film A Bridge Too Far, the Laurence Olivier character is loosely based on the Gerrit von Marnen character. And that staircase, again, the building is not a hotel or anything anymore. It's now private flats. But when the developer came to convert it, he was told that he needed to keep certain items from the building intact, and that staircase is still there, and you can literally sit on there, and they have a small demonstration, a small exhibition about what was happened here. The other thing I need to just briefly mention is, obviously, by this time, the 21st, 22nd onwards, medical supplies were running low. There was little food, no water. They were draining the central heating systems for water, and there were more and more casualties. So sometimes people had to walk on stretcher trestles to walk round some of the wards because there was no room to walk on the floors. So if we quickly go on, please, Jason. And then across the road from the Skernord going north was another hotel called the Vrijweg, and that was used as an overspill facility and for as an overspill facility. Interestingly enough, that was manned by a few men from 2 section of 181, but in the evening of the 18th of September, Corporal Coolin from 16th Parish Field Ambulance, who had arrived by glider on the second day with a jeep and trailer full of medical supplies, couldn't get into Arnhem, so he was commandeered by 181 and sent to work in the Skernord. Corporal Cooling won a Distinguished Conduct Medal for his work at Arnhem, and it says that he actually carried out operations because there weren't any medical officer, performed minor operations under local anaesthetic, and he was himself wounded on the 23rd of September by a shell fire, and he used an inverted floor brush as a crutch, and that's in his citations. And then another German photograph, a jeep carrying a guy called Jeffrey Holmes, who was another medic, was bringing some wounded down to the Vrijweg, and that was hit again by a mortar or artillery shell, and that is the remains of the wrecked jeep. So we've only got a couple more slides to go, ladies and gentlemen, we're pleased to hear. If we can quickly go to the next one. And this is, I call this Colonel Weaver and Kate to Horse House and a bit of myth and reality. So there on the left-hand side, you have the character from the film. Theirs is A Bridge Too Far, Colonel Weaver, who was in fact Colonel Warwick. Kate to Horse House, I'm sure you will all remember the scene in the film where Laurence Olivier and Colonel Weaver go up to the Kate to Horse House and say, can we use the house for the lightly wounded? To the best of my knowledge, Graham Warwick in real life never got there, and the guy in the middle was a guy called Captain Randall Martin, who was the regimental medical officer of the Light Regiment. He's the guy that knocked on the door. So basically, Kate to Horse allowed her house to be used as a regimental aid post. Again, by the end of the battle, it was literally overcrowded with around 300 wounded in there. There were 57 men were buried in her garden, which is now a little memorial called the Pond of Peace. And another one of my good friends, David Whiteman, he actually worked in there with Captain Randall Martin. And that became the only medical facility in Lower Oosterbeek. That was number 10 on the map. You're pleased to only 4 or 5 more slides to go, so we'll quickly crack on. And this, as I call, was one of the most essential medical items ever taken to Arnhem, or even in the airborne forces, even in the medical services. As I say, it's difficult in these days of health and safety. It's difficult to see them being carried in the medical supply, but Capstan non-filters and silver service in tins of 50 were included in the dressing packs as well. The airborne medics had a dressing pack known as the Don pack, which was enough to treat dressings for around 10 patients, and that included a tin of 50 cigarettes. There was also what was known as a comforts pack as well, that included 250 cigarettes. So as you can see, in those days, a fag and a cup of char were essential medical supplies. 181 actually took a chest of tea with them, which I think is 120 pounds worth of tea, a sack of sugar of 112 pounds, and 96 tins of milk to keep the patients going while there. The problem was, I think you're probably all aware by now, Monty's, well, 30 Corps never arrived in the 48 to 72 hours they were, and so the casualties could not be evacuated, and some blokes who were wounded on the first day were still on their same stretcher or lying on the floor 9 days later, and some of them have been wounded 2 and 3 more times in the medical facilities. So again, if we could go to the next slide. So regretfully, of course, the decision was taken, as we know in the film, for the 1st Airborne Division to be withdrawn across the Rhine, and it was known as Operation Berlin, and that gives you some idea of how many medics came back from the 600 who went. There was 1 officer and 30 men. So obviously the one guy from the Air Landing Light Regiment, that was David Whiteman, because he was one of the medical orderlies attached to them. So I always say that that's about in simplistic terms, 631, it's a 95% casualty rate. Obviously not all killed. So just 3 more slides to go, 4, sorry. So just a quick one for hopefully dispel a myth again. It is often said that all the medics were men in these 2 groups of non-combatants, i.e. Quakers and conscientious objectors. So in the 1st Airborne Division, out of the 600 medics who went to Arnhem, just 6 were conscientious objectors, but in the 6th Airborne Division, there were lots more. And of course, you probably also, the other myth that you sometimes see in some of the books is the medics weren't armed, but I'm sure you've noticed on 3 or 4 of the photographs, medics carrying pistols. So if we could just go to the next slide, please. So as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, the end, coming to the end. With the end of the war in all theatres, it was decided to keep only 1 Airborne Division, the 6th. The units in the 1st Airborne Division disbanded towards the end of 1945. Eventually the airborne forces to reduce so that only 1 medical unit was needed. This was 127, which in 1947 became 23 PFA, a number it retained till it was disbanded in 1977, and 23 PFA was reformed after the Falklands. So the next slide, please. So just to bore you briefly, ladies and gentlemen, if any of you are interested, there's 2 little books and booklets that I have done. Red Berets and Red Crosses, the story of the medical services in the 1st Airborne Division of World War II, and Arnhem Surgeon, the story of Captain Michael James. And if we go to the next one, please, which I think is almost any questions. And as I say, is if anybody wants to contact me afterwards, I am on Facebook and Twitter, and I'm happy to be contacted with any questions.